Today's webinar will discuss the topic, how to implement anti-racist ministries. How to implement anti-racist ministries. And the goal of this webinar is to help you as you begin your journey, or as you're in the middle of your journey, help you think about what I can do. Where do I start? Who do I talk to? And so today we brought a very special guest speaker with us, the Reverend Dr. Giovanni Arroyo. He is the General Secretary of the General Commission on Religion and Race for the United Methodist Church. He's the lead official of the denominational agency that cultivates racial inclusion and full participation of all people into the work, witness, and the life of the church. He has a Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology and Sociology from the City College of New York. He has a Master's of Divinity from Wesley Theological Seminary, a Master's of Science in Management from the University of Maryland, a Master of Arts in Clinical Mental Health from the University of the Cumberlands, a Doctor of Ministry on Transformational Leadership in the Wesleyan Perspective from Wesley Theological Seminary in partnership with Cambridge University and the Methodist House of Studies in Cambridge. He's also from United Kingdom, and a Pastoral Care Skills Certificate from Blanton Peel Graduate Institute of Mental Health and Religion. Try saying that 10 times fast. He comes with us with a lot of experience, with a heart for inclusion, and I'm very excited that he's going to be leading the conversation today. So, Reverend Dr. Giovanni, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Erwin. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in the midst of this hurricane relief and trying to just navigate all that is happening within your conference boundaries. My prayers are with you as you lead in this time of healing and restructuring and regrouping as a church. I want us, as we talk about anti-racism, I think I was thinking about going back to one of the most basic things that I remember that many times we forget as United Methodists. And it's our book of discipline that one of our articles specifically reminds us of this work. And I just want to read briefly what it states as it helps us to think of why we should implement anti-racism ministries or task force or groups to address some of these issues. It's Article 5, paragraph 5 in the book, in our Constitution. And it says, the United Methodist Church proclaims the value of each person as a unique child of God and commits itself to the healing and wholeness of all persons. The United Methodist Church recognizes that the sin of racism has been destructive to its unity throughout its history. Racism continues to cause painful divisions and marginalization. The United Methodist Church shall, and I love that word in the book of discipline, which means we need to do it, confront and seek to eliminate racism, whether in organizations or in individuals, in every facet of its life and in society at large. And the United Methodist Church should work collaboratively with others to address concerns that threaten the cause of racial justice at all times in all places. I use this because it reminds us that we as a denomination, as leaders of the United Methodist Church, we have already a commitment to addressing the realities of racism, how they're manifested in our own ministry settings, in our communities, in our own conference, and beyond the boundaries of your conference. We are reminded that this work of anti-racism is not new. It's been all along part of who we are called to be, but many times we have not actually understood the complexities of what that means. As I think, as we think about how we implement anti-racism work, I always want to invite you to start with the why. Why are you at this time engaging, working towards starting anti-racism work? I think we have to be cautious about it not being a checkoff for our work. but that there is a true understanding of the implications and the commitment that it has for us. So I think understanding your why is going to be so important as you think about how you build your ministry. Many times, the why also helps us have a clear scope of how we're going to address anti-racism within the parameters that we set. As we think about this, I think we also need to consider who is part of these conversations that we want to be part of as we think anti-racism as a pivotal or central value of who we are. Who's sitting at your tables of anti-racism? Who's leading the work? There is this notion in some areas that because it's anti-racism work, we want to hear the voices of people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, and how it impacts them. But at the same time, we could easily also fall into the place of putting again the burden, the time consumption on people of color to lead the work. And I think it's important to recognize that as a Black, Indigenous person of color who is already impacted day in, day out with the realities of racism in our society, adding to then helping us how to navigate it, it's also taking away some responsibility for our white siblings to lead the work. There is a partnership, but who takes the lead? It's an important question for you to discuss as you think about how you're implementing your anti-racism commitment. I think one of the things that we need to be clear, and I think as you think about anti-racism, what does anti-racism mean for you? How do you define anti-racism? And I think a quick and simple definition for me will be like anti-racism. By anti-racism, we mean working against forces that sustain racism. And many times when we're addressing racism, we stay at what I call the individual or interpersonal level of racist experiences, interactions. For example, me and Erwin might have an interaction that may cause some racial tensions or that we with some other person, but we stay at that individual or interpersonal relationship. But we never get to really focus a lot in the structural or the systemic racism, which has been created through policies, through practices, by systems that we participate. And I think to consider our anti-racism work, addressing those forces is really to focus more on the systemic, on the structural reality, on the institutional patterns that have caused systems, practices, or behaviors that have hindered or disadvantaged communities of color, communities that are marginalized, which has benefited specifically white normative behaviors or communities. And so I think that's an important element to think about as you think about implementing your anti-racism groups is what systems are we wanting to address? What are the things in our community, in our context, that really are barriers, that really are impacting our communities of color, and that we could actually start addressing so that equity could be experienced, and that we could start addressing the inequities that are benefiting one group over another. And I think that's an important element for sometimes for us to think about. I think there is a tendency when I work with groups, we have our laundry list because we are visionaries. We want to address all these different intersections of where race and racism has come into play in people's lives. But then we need to figure out where is the niche that we could first work on and really address it in a more systemic approach so that we could see impact in that area. And that's going to create a lot of conversations with people who are impacted. Now, this is important. I think part of it is the conversations you have. Like in the church, in my experience, sometimes that's been that we create programs, we create resources, we create all these other activities based on what we believe others need. But we have not really engaged with them to really understand if that's what they were needing. And then we wonder why, man, that was a good program, but not too many people showed up. Well, were we addressing a gap? Or were we just providing something that they already have somewhere else being offered to them? And so as we think about being anti-racist ministry, we need to think about what system, what area that we think could be beneficial to the communities that we have direct connection if we're going to do based on our community needs. I think that's an important element as we consider that. I think part of your first steps to doing anti-racist work is like, understanding your why, understanding your community, understanding what are the systems that are already in place. And, we immediately go to the big ones like healthcare. You go to education, which there's a lot of inequities in those systems. But sometimes are things that we even do in our local churches. What are some of our policies that we have implemented or decisions that we have made that impact the community that we're serving, but that we have never considered to hear their perspective before we made that decision? Being an anti-racist church will require us to take a step back and consider how what we call racial equity impact assessments, which is a tool that could help you in doing some anti-racist work. And that's a whole different webinar, to be honest, but I'll give you a big scope of what racial equity impact assessment could help anti-racist team is really think about an area that you think there's inequity. And then it engages, what is the issue? What is the data that we have? What are some of the implications of that issue to what populations? And then engaging those populations that are impacted by that area and hear their perspective. How could this be different? How could change of this policy or this practice be done differently that it will then change the experience that you have? And you gather that information and then you start looking at how could we impact a change through a lens of racial equity, because the voices of people who are being impacted are now incorporated in our assessment and analysis, and then offer a way forward. And I think that's an important piece that many times we don't do carefully. And I think one of the tendencies of our society and human tendency, or what I call is the drive-through phenomenon. What I mean that is this instant gratification desire that we want to do things and immediately see change. But when we're dealing with systems and policies of inequities and even practices that we incorporate, but they're not written anywhere, but it's a practice of how we do things, it takes time. And so we must be willing to be in this work long term, that it will take time to really get to a place where we can see a shift happening, but that we need to celebrate every little change that moves us to the direction that we are aiming for, which should be equity for all. And so I think as another, I'm putting I'm going to put on my hat as a mental health professional, as we do anti-racism work, and as we engage with people of BIPOC community in this work, I think we need to be very attentive to how we not cause more harm to individuals or groups as we engage in this work. Our 3 simple rules are: do good, do no harm, and stay in love with God. And there's sometimes good intent. We always have good intent, right? But sometimes the intent that we have may have not the positive impact. And so how do we engage these conversations, understanding the reality that many BIPOC members have been scarred, have traumatic experiences, who have increasingly, I share this, we've been living in a pandemic of COVID, but after George Floyd, we are living in a pandemic of racism in this country, and even more a pandemic of mental health, because the microaggressions that BIPOC communities have been experiencing since George Floyd has increased so much. And so those microaggressions gets to a level that you keep compounding, but you don't have a way to address them, that could lead to racial trauma in the future. And many of us are not aware, as BIPOC community members, that that's part of what we're experiencing sometimes. And so as we think about how we engage, being attentive of how we have the conversations in a way that we are not also creating more harm to those individuals, and creating opportunity for people to be able to share what they're able to at the time they can. I think that's an important piece for us as we think about this work. I think now this will be my last statement probably, because as you think about the why, who's part of the group, how you engage with others, the systems that you want to address, and understanding that there is racial trauma in some communities, then you need to think about how do we, as committee members or people trying to implement this, get more clarity and get more educated in the do's and don'ts of anti-racism work. And be attentive, and goes back to intent versus impact. There might be good things that we think are good, but the impact will be negative. So us taking the time to learn more clearly about the things that are not really effective strategies for anti-racism work. And for that, I just give you this example. Because because Florida is in the midst of hurricane recovery, and talk about systems, right? Observe who will get support immediately from agencies, and what communities have a harder time getting support or resources in the recovery efforts. There is evidence that BIPOC communities have higher challenges in getting resources in response to recovery efforts. We saw that through FEMA in Hurricane Maria. We've seen that through different experiences in how and where resources go and how are they divvied out in communities. That's a systemic reflection. Hopefully it has changed, but that is a way of saying, okay, what is the practice happening here? Is there something that we need to be considering that now, because of the practice or policy or how the system works, that has created a barrier for others? And so I think it's important for us, as you in this moment engaging in the hurricane and recovery, how some of the systems might be showing how racism is implemented in them. And what does it mean for us to respond? And what does that look like? And how do we educate ourselves in regards to those systems or practices? So I think we need to think about all these things as we engage in starting an anti-racism ministry group. as leaders.
I think that's great. And I think it's such good information, and it's also very practical. And if anybody has any questions for Dr. Giovanni, please share them in the chat, share them in the Q&A box. But I have some questions for you. You mentioned almost like a process, like a 5-step process. You started out with, before you implement ministries, begin with the why. Why are you doing this? The second part was then, who is going to be part of this conversation? Who is going to be part of this team? And do so, think about who you're going to have in your team with some boundaries in mind, where you're not putting all this on a person of color, where you understand that a person of color is likely dealing with racial trauma. But I want to pause there and just ask you, when or do we know that we have a good team? Is it some kind of like, is it a white person and a person of color? Is it, when do we know, like, okay, this is the team?
If there was a great that's like A plus B equals C squared kind of thing, right? And we had that magic combo, I think the church would be in a better place. I think there's a lot of factors involved in a good team. I think it's important to understand that, for me, I think about heart set, mindset, and skill set. You know, we have to have the heart set of being anti-racist disciples of Jesus Christ. That's we are to live the gospel of Jesus Christ and live our baptismal vows that we proclaim. Then we should be able to come to this team as people who have the heart set to dismantle racism, who have a heart to address systems. That's an important piece. I think people who are also have a mindset of thinking about what it means for us to be anti-racist. We could have the heart set, but if you don't have the mindset, you know, we stay stagnant. So we need to have people who are willing to learn or be able, who already have some knowledge of what is anti-racism? How does that go about? What are some things we need to do? What are some of the racism that we need to address? And the skill set is like people who also have some skills. Not everybody says, but some people have some analysis skills, people who have organizing skills, people who have a sense of community and have connections with the community. I think as you think about this work more and more, are there community members who are not part of your church that you should engage with? You know, research has shown us that young people and want to be part of a church that is a church that's in action in responding to social justice issues. Research has shown that. And so, are there young people who have a passion for this, who might not have this, the whole spirituality of it, but have the skills and the heart set that because of that, and they feel that they're part of this group, could then really help those in that group to see things from that perspective. And I think in leadership, I think context is going to be played a role. It will be good. Sometimes it's good to have, sometimes for this work, co-leaders. Sometimes in your context, it might be one leader. But I think as a group, you need to figure out where people's strengths are and who are people who really are able to galvanize. This is really a work of galvanizing as groups to think about what are the realities that we're addressing, and then how do we go and be prophetic about it. I think one of the roles of this group is being prophetic. And what is hard is going to be being prophetic to your own church. So
I think that's great advice, Dr. Arroyo. Heart set, mindset, skill set. And we have a couple questions coming in here. I do want to ask one. You could just offer a quick response so we can get to some of the panelists' questions, but for the whole participants' questions. But a lot of people who come to these webinars are pastors in um, different cultural settings, right? Latino pastor serving a white church, African American pastor serving a white church. Can we, how do we create an anti-racist task force to do anti-racist ministries in white spaces, in all white spaces?
And I'll be real quick in the answer to this. I have served 22 years in ministry, pastoral ministry, and most of them have been in cross-racial, cross-cultural ministry, what you are identifying right now. And so I think we need to have a different conversation, because we don't want to put the responsibility in those settings on the pastor without having nurtured that congregation to even receive and welcome their pastor. There's a lot of that going on. And so I think there's a whole different conversation about what does it mean for BIPOC pastors in cross-racial, cross-cultural ministry, and how do they engage in anti-racism work? Because we don't want to place them in a place that they become a target, because there has not been fertile ground in that ministry setting, or there's still some suspicion of why that pastor's been there. And we could have a whole conversation about that. But I think it starts first for that congregation. I think it has to be about first building intercultural competency, understanding difference, acknowledging the difference, and then how do we respect those differences to move to some of the contextual responses. And some churches, they may be ready there, but I think because of that ministry setting, we have to look at other factors that are at play.
That's great advice. Great advice. Okay, we have a question from one of the participants, and I'll read it to you. In regards to dismantling racism as a conference, how do we close the gap between where conference leadership, bishop, cabinet, boom, majority of clergy, is where most of our congregants and congregations are? How do we encourage clergy to really engage this work and lead their congregations in it? That's a question from Corey Jones.
So let me answer the first part. I think in regarding the conference and the gap between who we are as a conference leadership and how that translates to the congregation kind of thing, if I get it. It might be interesting for the Florida conference, and I don't know if Florida did this already or not, but sometimes we assume things without looking at facts and data, right? Have we done a annual conference audit of who is the membership in terms of leadership positions in the Florida annual conference? Who are they? Not only who they are, but let's look at race, gender. Let's look at all different variables. What positions are being held by certain groups and all that. At the conference level, looking from cabinet to boards of ordained ministry to trustees to a connectional table, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. See who's in those leadership positions. It just gives you a snapshot. This is who we have leading us. And then look at who we are in congregations and in clergy leadership. And then that will help us see where the gaps are, really in a very context way. Like, we're no longer being subjected. This is what the numbers say. And once we look at that data, it might be okay. So how do we address some of these gaps and start thinking about strategies or how we do it? But I think the bigger conversation that will come out of that is when we are trying to do anti-racism work, we need to talk about power. And what does it mean to relinquish some power for some people? And so I think to address that, that will lead us to where do we need to relinquish power so that we could have a better representation, but not only representation, because I think representation could lead to tokenism in some ways, in some places, but that people who sit at the table who have also power to make decisions. And I think that's a big piece in this kind of work. The second question was, what was it? I lost. How do we do this work in the local church? Well, I think we actually, and I'll share this with you, the General Commission on Religion and Race, we are working on a 6-week Lectio Divina type of institutional equity Bible study as a very soft entry to get people to start looking at equity and stuff that way for us to biblically engage in that. So I think one of the things for many congregations is how do we understand the culture of the church? Because people understand that people have equated anti-racism work, equity work as circular work and not gospel driven. And so we need to be able to, again, address the disconnect that we have in some form and fashion created and start helping seeing that doing anti-racism work, doing equity work is part of our discipleship. There is also some resources on our website that it's called What Is, and like simple one-pagers that give a definition to a term, gives a theological framing, an example, and questions that you could do for groups, just to start a basic understanding, foundational understanding of what it means to be BIPOC. What does it mean to be, what is ableism? What is colonialism? What is migration? What is decolonization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are being built. And those could be easy, short group conversations, but you're starting to build some consensus of some language, of how language is being used. And I will invite you to all go to the www.gcorr.org website and go into the resources that are available there as well. There's video series on, for example, Robin DiAngelo, who's been a big, writer. She is one of the presenters for us. And there's a study guide and there's a discussion guide for people, etc. for that.
I think this is all great, amazing stuff, Dr. Arroyo. I want to just close with kind of like giving you like a case study, okay?
Okay.
For you to kind of critique a little bit, okay? So here I am, I'm taking your advice. I started with the why, got a good group with me. I began to realize that part of the work is to change the culture of the church. Then I began to analyze what are the areas that change culture, and that's Bible study, right? Mm-hmm. Leadership, meetings, so that we can all get on the same page. So maybe the new Bible study will be on the biblical interpretation of equity that you'll put out. Mm-hmm. And then maybe we'll do a little sermon series on it as we continue to change the culture of the church. Okay, right, we're going through hurricane relief. We got to take into consideration the fact that people of color have less access to resource. So what we're going to do also is we're going to go into African-American minority neighborhoods, and we're going to ask the churches and those who are helping in those neighborhoods how we can help. What can our church in this area do? And that's going to be our next steps. What do you think about that?
Let me first say, to change a culture of a church, an organizational culture shift takes about 7 years. It does not happen in 1 or 2 years. So we know what you laid out is the beginning foundations, right? A lot of education, Bible study, some leadership conversation, sermon series. But then when it gets hard for that culture change, is really how do we change who we are and how we function and how we do things. And so for some organizations, it takes longer than 7 years. For others, it could be 7 or less, but it doesn't happen in 1 year or 2 years. I just want to put that out there. It's to be very transparent because it takes a lot of work. Because a lot of the stuff that we do is it gets in a very, think about an onion. You take out the first layer. So first layer, let's talk about culture, who we are. Then let's take the next layer. Like, what is the culture of our community? Then the next layer, let's do some Bible study. But we haven't got to the heart of what it means for us to be an anti-racist church yet. Because we're slowly unpeeling things until we get to the tough conversations. So that's the first thing I come to think about when I think about culture change. I think you got the right team, you have the culture, and then you're ready to reach out. And I think an important piece that you said is we're going to go out to these communities, we're going to ask them how we're going to help versus we're going to go help them. I think there's a shift right there, right? A mindset shift. We're gonna offer, but we want to hear from them how we could be of service to you, how we could help you navigate. We need to be also, if we're gonna be anti-racist and culturally competent leaders, we need to let them lead. And they are our culture informants to that community. So that we are not going there to also cause more chaos. And especially when it comes to this kind of relief, in other words, I haven't done hurricane relief. I've done 9/11 in New York City as a chaplain and all the chaos around that. And you want to make sure that you're doing things that are not going to even cause more chaos in a very chaotic moment. So I think that's a great practice asking. I think the question might be that as you do Bible study, is that where are we going to start having the heart to heart conversations of who we've been and how has that also limited others to be part of the church that we are. And that's, I'll give you an example. I served a cross-racial, cross-cultural church that was created in 1901, German. And it was a German-speaking church. Everything was German. And World War II came in, they had to go to English immediately. And 103 years later, they get the first Latino pastor. And it was a culture challenge. But it took me, I was there actually 7 years of a lot of hard conversations of who they were, acknowledging the history, but also projecting where God was calling us because our community had changed. And really, what does that mean? Galvanizing to a new vision of community that's reflective of the mission field that we have. It's going to be important. And I'll shut up.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your time today. I feel like these conversations are always, the goal of it is to spark a new idea, to spark movement, to spark action. And you've given us so much to think about, very practical, very helpful. And, we will follow up with the racial equity impact assessments, the Bible study that you spoke about in equity, also even with the visions that we saw a pastor in the conference is doing, the visions kind of protocol that he uses for his churches. And we will follow up with everybody on our email list. So don't worry about it. You'll get all this information. But besides that, I just want to say thank you. You did a wonderful job, gave us so much to think about. And I hope that this really sparks some action in our conference. So thank you, Dr. Arroyo. Any closing words you want to share with us?
I think the first thing I'll say is, may God continue to give you the strength to do the work that God has placed in your hearts, and know that it's not going to be easy, but God will never leave us abandoned in this work. And so the other thing is, know that you have each other and that we need each other to be able to combat the systems of oppression that we're part of. And lastly, know that as you recover from hurricane and all that is happening, that you are part of a connectional church and that we are here to walk along and resource you as best as we can, but know that there is great possibilities when we have these conversations collectively. And so thank you for the opportunity to be with you. And I'll say, for those who are going to your cross-racial, cross-cultural pastors, Erwin, we have on November 16, Facing the Future conference for cross-racial, cross-cultural pastors, which is virtually. And it's really being still as a spiritual practice, where we have 2 United Methodists, an elder and a deacon, to present, but who are also licensed professional counselors, and helping us navigate what that means in this time for us as leaders serving in contexts that are not from our racial ethnic communities. So I'll share that to you so you can share that with the group.
Yeah, please do. Please do. Well, thank you again, Dr. Arroyo, and thank you to everybody who joined us today. And we'll see you next month, the first Wednesday of the month. Have a good day. God bless you.